Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to talk about weaning strategies and calf productivity. Dr. Kertz is here to share his thoughts with us. But before we get into that discussion, a reminder, if you have any questions, to feel free to post those there on your screen. Joining us from social media, you can post those directly in our social channels. So welcome, Dr. Kertz. Great to have you back with us here today.
Good to be back again.
So go ahead and tell us what we need to know about weaning strategies and calf productivity.
Well, first, a little background. If you look at the National Animal Health Monitoring Surveys, the last two were 2014 and then before that 2007. And from 2007 to 2014, the average amount of milk or milk replacer fed went from 4 quarts a day to 6 quarts a day. Now, that may not sound like much, but that's a 50% increase. Now, at the same time, probably because feeding more, the average weaning age went from 8 weeks to 9 weeks. So that's not surprising because as you feed more milk or milk replacer, the starter intake will be inversely related as established clearly in a study at Penn State by Gelsinger et al. So let's talk then about 3 critical periods for a calf. The first one I think is at calving, and that includes the environment, how clean it is, the cow, her condition, how colostrum is managed and fed, how clean it is. So that's the first critical period. The second critical period is the first 2 weeks of life, because that's when most health problems occur and most death losses occur. So those are the first two. But the third one isn't as widely recognized as it should be, and that is what I call the weaning transition period. That's 2 weeks before full weaning and 2 weeks after full weaning. And if that is not done very well, then calves are going to struggle after their weaning. And that's shown by a NOM study that was done, a shorter version of the national survey and published in 2018, in which prior to weaning, calves were averaging 1.6 pounds daily gain. That's good because that'll double their birth weight in about 2 months. That's the goal. But after weaning, instead of increasing up to 1.8 to 2 pounds, they dropped down to 1.3 pounds. So that says there was not a good weaning transition. And most likely, in a lot of cases, it's because there's not adequate starter intake, or it's not well texturized, or you don't get adequate rumen development. So with that as background, let's look at a study that was done at the University of Idaho. At 72 Holstein calves, they did it in 2 different years. They had 40 females and 32 males. And you can see the data in the text. It was a 2x2 factorial because what they wanted to look at is the age of weaning and how abruptly they were weaned. So they had one group that was, let's see, 2x2. So there you go. One group that was weaned at 6 to 7 weeks, and another group at 8 weeks. And then they were weaned at a 3-day period or over a period of more days than that. So there's a bit of a range there. And the gradual weaning was done over 14 days. So that's the 2 things. Now, when they were weaned at 49 days, 42 days, they had 139 pounds of dry milk replacer fed. And when they were weaned later, that was increased more. So there's a difference in the amount of milk replacer fed, as you would expect. Now, if we look at how they were handled, they were in hutches, bedded with coarse sand, so you don't have any issues with flies growing in the sand. And it was done in September to November 1 year, in October, December the second year. In addition, the milk replacer was a 24% protein, 17 fat, which is a good, fairly good level of each of those. And they said they were fed twice daily at 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. And the text says that it was a texturized starter, but there's no indication of how well texturized it was. And also, that was not beginning to be fed until 3 weeks. We'll come back to that point later, 3 weeks of age. So, in addition, they fed chopped alfalfa hay, which I thought was strange because if you got a well texturized starter, you don't need any hay because that can create gut fill. And that hay only had 12.3% protein. And I don't know if that's because when you chop alfalfa hay, the leaves are very fragile and you may lose some of that either in the form of dust or it settles out. So maybe that was why they ended up with a lower protein alfalfa hay as indicated. So male calves then were orally bolused with a rumen pH logger for the last 3 to 5 days at the weaning transition. And so they measured rumen pH directly, and we'll look at those data. And it was recorded every 2 minutes. Okay, and they established that if the pH in rumen was below 5.8, that would be acidosis. That was their definition. Then they took some blood samples as well. So, okay, let's look at the first graph then. And these are provided by Dr. Anna Larman, who was at the University of Idaho before he moved to the University of Alberta in Edmonton. So it was a collaborative project. So if we look at the average daily gains, you got the early weaned calves in the light green and the later weaned calves. Let's see. No, early weaned abruptly, first column, early weaned gradual. Now notice that the daily gain during the weaning process was higher when there was a gradual weaning instead of over 14 days instead of over 3 days. And that's almost 2/10 of a kilo, not quite. So there's an advantage there in daily gain to the gradual weaning. Now, if you look at the last two bars in that figure, you see that when they were late weaned and abruptly weaned, they performed the poorest. And that's probably not too surprising because they're fed more milk replacer for a longer period of time, and then they don't get much starter intake before that, and so they don't have as good rumen development. So that was really very poor. That's only about 1/10 of a kilo daily gain when they were late weaned abruptly over 3 days. However, when they were late weaned gradual, there's a huge difference. But again, the late weaned calves did not gain as well as the early weaned calves, no matter how they were weaned, abruptly or gradual. Now let's look at the next figure, figure 2. The forage intake is percent of body weight, which I don't like as well because you don't have an absolute number, you got a percentage number. But if you look at the early weaned, they ate a little bit more forage as a percent of body weight than when they were abruptly weaned, than gradual. And then when they were weaned later, they had some higher intakes of the forage versus the earlier weaned, abrupt, and gradual. On the other hand, if you look at the actual numbers, if you took 0.05%, which is about the average across those 4 treatments, 0.05% times, let's say you had half a kilo, or you got about 6/10 of a kilo, 0.05 times 6/10 of a kilo, You see, that's a very small amount of alfalfa. And like I said, if it was a well-texturized starter, you wouldn't even need that alfalfa. So you got to chop it and feed it and pick it up and so on. So it's not even worth the problem. Now, if you look at the B section, the grain or starter intake as a percent of body weight, you see that was much higher. But again, notice that the early weaned abrupt calves had much lower intake of the starter than the early weaned gradual calves. And in late wean, that difference is accentuated. So you can see that in both cases, whether they were early weaned or late weaned, there was a benefit to the gradual weaning over 14 days and over 3 days. All right, now let's look at the next graph, figure 3. These are rumen pHs. Remember, they had these boluses, which were pH loggers in the calves. And they define anything under 5.8 pH as being acidotic. So if you look at the section A of that graph, you see that they're all in about the 5 to 6 range. So according to their definition, they would all been somewhat acidotic. The early weaned abrupt had a higher pH, about 6, than the other gradual weaned. And then there was not much difference the late weaned calves. Now, if we look at section B, let's see, that is the mean. A is the minimum, B is the mean, and then you have C, which are the maximums. I'm just astonished at those numbers because it's very unusual to have rumen pHs over 7, and you see most of these are running between 7 and 8. So I don't know what was going on there, but that seems to be really out of whack. But of course, those are the extremes now. And as you go you look at the A section, there you have the averages. Now let's look at figure 4. There we have the duration of subacute rumination, acidosis. And so you see that there's fairly high, that's minutes per day. So 300 minutes to 350, divide that by 60, that's 5 hours. That's a fair amount of that. We'll get back to that in a minute, this whole rumen pH. So there's a significant amount of time they were below their 5.8 threshold. Now, if we look at the bullet points now, let's try to pull out what are the key points here. So starter intake over time largely determines rumen development and minimizes post-weaning slump. So there was a texturized study, a starter fed, but we don't know for sure what the extent of the texturized was. But that would be beneficial. And then hay was also fed. But with a well-texturized starter, that's unnecessary. And there was another study done at British Columbia in 2011 published, in which they had a poorly texturized starter, and when they fed alfalfa hay chopped, they didn't eat much of it, but it created gut fill, considerable gut fill. I believe it was about 10 pounds on a 200-pound calf. So you're better off if you don't feed hay with a well-texturized starter, because you're not going to have gut fill. Then the milk replacer fed was at a very high level, up to 2.6 pounds a day. So that means that they're less likely to eat much starter because of the inverse relationship there. And the other problem was that they didn't begin to feed the starter until 3 weeks of age. Now, you might say, if you're feeding that much milk replacement, you're not going to eat much starter. That's true. But there's a good indication from a number of studies I've been involved in that shows that the starter intake will approximately double each week. So if you only have, let's say, a tenth of a pound starter intake the first week, that would double to 2/10 second week, to 4/10 the third week, and they only began feeding in the third week. So then they start at a lower level, and so it will minimize the starter intake before weaning. So it's always good to start the starter feeding right away when you start beginning to feed water and after they've gone off of colostrum and transition milk. Now, the rumen pHs, as I said, were a little bit puzzling. These were data loggers, so that's a direct measurement. It's not like when you stomach tube them. You have to be very careful and good at it, and you have to really watch so that you don't get saliva contaminated it, because the saliva will have an elevated pH of what you pull out. So I don't understand why the pHs were that high. But the other thing to consider is that in young calves before weaning, they have low rumen pHs. And I think it is due to the fact they don't have a resident protozoa population yet. Protozoa help cows keep rumen pH somewhat buffered by deamination, which creates amino groups, and in that acid environment pulls up 2 hydrogen ions to make NH4 plus. And then the other thing that protozoa do is they engulf starch, and that takes it out of the circulation temporarily, and it minimizes the acidosis. So young calves always have low pHs. 5.5 is not unusual. And then there's a French study that I cite here as one of the publications. If you look at that, you can see that they gradually increase their rumen pH until they get to more normal levels for cows. So that's a summation of the study. It's a good study that shows a number of good pieces of information. And then I'd say the bottom line is gradual weaning is better because you don't abruptly wean them. You give them a chance to develop more intake and rumen development. And then you also have to consider that you have to have adequate starter intake for 2 to 3 weeks before you actually wean them in order to minimize the chances of having a slump after weaning.
A reminder to post any questions you might have there in the chat for Dr. Kertz. So Al, so what I'm hearing you saying when it comes to when to start that feeder, that starter, that texturized starter, when you start feeding it, they had started at what, 3 weeks, beginning at 3 weeks?
Yes.
So you think calf productivity would be, I mean, there'd be a boost in productivity if they were starting it sooner, maybe at 1 or 2 weeks, or what would be the ideal time to start that?
I think it would be better. I don't know if it would improve their daily gain by weaning, but it would more likely help them more after weaning, because the more starter intake they have for a longer period of time before weaning, the less likely they're to have a slump after weaning. So I always cringe when I hear somebody say, well, they're not going to eat much starter, so don't begin feeding into 2 or 3 weeks. Well, you've lost 2 or 3 weeks of starter intake. And when you do that, you don't have the benefit of the doubling of the starter intake each week for 2 or 3 weeks before you begin to feed it. So you're less likely to have the good rumen development before weaning, and more likely to have a slump afterwards.
Do you think they do that because they think it's a cost savings? Is that why they would hold off? Or
no, I think it's because it seems futile to feed just a little bit of starter, and calves aren't eating much of it. But it does require some management. For instance, you're not going to put 5 pounds of starter in that bucket a day because you're only going to get a little bit eaten. So you start out with maybe a 1/4 pound for that first week, And then you can see that they're cleaning it up, and you increase that and you double that and so on. So I think it's mainly a management thing. And the other thing is, it's sort of like, well, since I'm feeding so much milk replacer, they don't need a starter. That's true, they don't. But then you're setting yourself up for not having adequate starter intake before weaning and after weaning and having a slump.
So best to get them going when you have that opportunity here,
Yes.
nice and early. So
Yeah.
if you'd like to read Dr. Kertz's paper on this topic, there is a link there in the chat. If you missed that, you also can find it on feedstuffs.com or in the August issue of Feedstuffs, which is coming out next week. So a lot of different places you can get that. Dr. Kertz, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight.
Good. We'll see you next month.
Very good. All right. And thank you all for joining us too. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format at feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.